All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive pivot in government policy. We're going to objectively break down the historical claims, the ideological arguments, and the really sweeping policy announcements that just dropped at a major government conference focused entirely on what the administration is calling far-left terrorism. We're taking the actual transcripts straight from top officials, including the Secretary of State and the Treasury Secretary, and looking at exactly what they said, how they're framing this issue, and the actual mechanics of what they plan to do about it. To keep things strictly focused today, we're going to break this down into 5 key areas: redefining the terror threat, historical waves of violence, citing recent incidents, the ideological argument, and finally, the new policies and tactics. This should help us separate the intense rhetoric from the tangible actions the government is taking.
All right, part 1, redefining the terror threat.
So, Secretary of State Marco Rubio took the stage with a pretty bold claim. He argued that for the last 25 years, basically since 9/11, our entire Western counterterrorism playbook has been exclusively focused on radical Islamic extremism. And hey, he acknowledged that this worked. It successfully degraded networks like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but he argues that this singular focus created a rigid doctrine that completely ignored a rising tide of political extremism coming from the far left.
In fact, he said the national security apparatus has had a massive blind spot for far too long. He pointed the finger straight at academia, the press, and legacy institutions, claiming they've maintained a really dangerous double standard. According to Rubio, these institutions treat right-wing violence as pure evil, while brushing off left-wing violence as just a tragic excess of idealism, basically excusing it instead of prosecuting it as genuine terrorism.
Moving on to part 2, historical waves of violence. To justify pointing the state's vast machinery toward this new target, officials didn't just look at today. They dug deep into Cold War history. They brought up the Weather Underground, planting thousands of bombs across the U.S. in the 70s, the Red Brigades actually kidnapping and executing Italy's prime minister in 78, and those horrific Shining Path massacres in Peru back in the 80s. The speakers were basically drawing a straight, undeniable line from the tactics of those historical militant groups right to the movements operating today. And here is the absolute kicker they wanted the audience to remember: 93%. Secretary Rubio cited that between 1970 and 1980, a staggering 93% of terrorist attacks in the West were driven by the extremist left. To put that in perspective, he's arguing that far-left political terrorism isn't some modern novelty. It was literally the dominant form of political violence for a huge chunk of the modern era.
Which brings us to Section 3, citing recent incidents.
Jumping from the history books to right now, the conference laid out a really grim catalog of recent international and domestic tragedies. We're talking about a 72-year-old woman firebombed in her home in Greece, a deliberately sparked blackout in freezing Berlin that left an elderly woman dead, a young guy beaten in the streets of France, and that horrific Nashville Catholic school shooting. The strategy here was to take all these seemingly isolated local events and categorize them under one single umbrella: a coordinated, transnational, far-left menace. Bringing it back to the home front, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller pointed to a jaw-dropping metric: an 8,000% claimed spike in violent assaults on federal immigration, or ICE, officers. Miller didn't frame this as just random protests getting out of hand. No, he characterized it as organized, funded insurrection and armed resistance against the federal government. Things got incredibly personal when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually stepped away from his prepared script. He brought up an assassination attempt on his own life by a left-wing activist in February 2024, literally hours after he was sworn in. He looked right at the media in the room and challenged them, saying, "Hey, if you think this threat is made up, you should probably show up and report on my attacker's upcoming sentencing in court." All right, part 4, the ideological argument. Beyond just tracking the physical violence, the conference spent a lot of time psychoanalyzing the motives behind it. Stephen Miller used some incredibly charged language here. He argued that left-wing activists aren't driven by genuine, if misguided, political beliefs, but by deep psychological resentment. He literally said they are fundamentally motivated by envy and hatred toward what is beautiful and what is good, essentially framing it as an attack on societal success and traditional family structures. Building on that psychological profile, the speakers laid out how they believe this ideology rots democratic institutions from the inside out. They pointed to tactics like intimidating Supreme Court justices to strong-arm rulings, or relying on jury nullification, claiming sympathetic jurors in big cities just refuse to convict activists even with clear evidence. They also argued these groups use civil liberties as a convenient shield, all while running a massive transnational network of dark money and safe houses tied to Antifa.
And finally, Section 5, New Policies and Tactics.
So, what is the government actually doing about this? Well, the absolute linchpin of this whole new crackdown is a directive known as NSPM 7. That's a National Security Presidential Memorandum, and it represents a massive, unprecedented mobilization. It officially orders all federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies to actively work together to identify, defund, debank, arrest, and prosecute domestic political groups that they classify as terrorists. It's honestly like a giant coordinated dragnet across multiple departments. You've got the State Department actively slapping foreign terrorist organization labels on far-left groups. You've got the Justice Department dangling up to $10 million in rewards to disrupt their funding networks. And then there's the Treasury Department, which is gearing up for some incredibly severe financial crackdowns.
Secretary Bessent was super explicit about what those Treasury crackdowns will look like. They are going to treat domestic nonprofits and charities with the exact same aggressive scrutiny they usually save for international terror syndicates like Hamas or Al-Qaeda. We're talking stripping tax-exempt statuses, hunting down charities acting as foreign money conduits, and unleashing OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, to sanction any sham nonprofits they think are shielding illicit funds.
So, wrapping this all up, as the government completely rewires its massive counterterrorism machine to target the political left, we're left with a monumental question. Will this unprecedented mobilization actually root out dangerous networks, or are these incredibly aggressive institutional tools going to fundamentally alter the boundaries of civil liberties and domestic protest in the years to come? It's a critical shift and absolutely something we'll be watching closely.